So to set the mood, let's read a. Okay, let me start that again. That was a bit weird. I'm like a freaking like a I'm
It was
like a
very sensual.
radio. I'm like a radio broadcaster. To set the mood. Nah, none of that. Okay. To set the mood, to get things going, to get the ball rolling. Let's read a quote by Big Z himself, Slavoj Žižek, saying, "Oh, by the way, I think he said this. This is not from one of his books. It's in fact from an interview he did, I believe. Regardless, it's something he said, or let's just assume it's something he said. Happiness was never important. The problem is that we don't know what we really want. What makes us happy is not to get what we want, but to dream about it. Happiness is for opportunists. So I think that the only life of deep satisfaction is a life of eternal struggle, especially struggle with oneself. If you want to remain happy, just remain stupid. Authentic masters are never happy. Happiness is a category of slaves." Slavoj Žižek. I deeply resonate with this quote. Although, of course, it can be elaborated and built upon, but something I resonate with more is this meme. So we're gonna do some. Oh wait, am I sharing? Can you see my screen? Yeah, we're gonna do some PewDiePie meme review. But look, before we get to the meme, the idea is that you first come to the realization that it's in some sense impossible to be happy, and then in some sense you accept that datum about life, and then what? However, though, this guy here isn't a stoic, bro. That's really important. I'm not saying he's saying, oh, you can never be happy, therefore control what you can control. Not at all. It's a bit more, I'd say he's more on the romantic side. So Euwyn, here's what I was thinking, right? Before the conversation, before we really get to the crux of the matter, maybe how do you think when people when people say happiness colloquially, what do you think people mean by that?
Yeah, well, that's the question. And I feel like with that quote by Zizek, you've really started with the start, but you've also started with the ending. Because it's like both the problem and the solution, right? You've said like, what is happiness? It's for X and it's just that. And for me, it's not that. So it's funny that we started with that. But no, I guess if we started from the really beginning, right? The question is always like, what is happiness? And the key context around here is similar to our last chat. I think when we chatted about marriage, it's really that it's this something we're dealing with. It's something that's very much permeating within society nowadays. And within the context of happiness, it's like the final pursuit for every layman out there, right? I don't think it's beyond reason to say that. Like, ask any person who walks on the street, like, what do you live for? Or like, why are you doing what you're doing? You ask them that 5 times, then they're like, oh, I'm just doing that to be happy. Like, why are you working? So I can earn money. Why are you earning money? So I can buy a house or I can go on a holiday. Why do you want to buy a house or go on a holiday? So that I can, fulfill my dream and tick off the bucket list. Why do you want to tick off your bucket list? So, and then this is where you start to get into like, more muddy territory. They're like, so to be happy, something like that.
Yeah, the buck stops at happiness all the time.
Yeah, it's just like it's usually, at least in my experience, is that kind of like line of thinking, right? It's like something like just to be happy. And you ask them like, why do you want to be happy? And that you don't go past that with the layman. So that's the context, I think, in which we are living in nowadays. That is, we're in a society. I don't know if it's changed over history. I don't know what it was 2,000 years ago, but at least right now, approach any layman on the street and happiness is usually very much the final goal. So the question right now, I guess, is what do they mean when they say that, right? Like, what do they mean when they say, I do this and that to be happy? And how does that match up to what we mean when we actually really talk about happiness? And I think like we can go on a long 5-hour discussion on like the various aspects and discussions on happiness, because I think the fact is that happiness itself as a concept, psychologically and philosophically speaking, is very, very muddy, right? It's very cloudy. Like we can't give happiness a one sentence definition that captures the full spirit of it.
It's like God.
It's like God. It's like love, right? It's like,
Oh, yeah.
I love you. Like, define love in a sentence, right?
Although I would argue though that I think here's, I would probably perhaps say it's the paradox of, sorry, I cut you off there, but the paradox is that in some sense, I think people know exactly what they mean by love. As in, when you're in love, you just know it. One doesn't really have to articulate it. If you're truly in love, you just know you're in love. Whereas with happiness, it's a bit iffy because it's like, in many ways, for me, happiness feels rather superficial or artificial. And you make a good point. What do you think? You reckon the category of happiness? Oh, let's put it a different way. Let's say the social phenomena of happiness being this thing that we constantly talk about. There was the Will Smith movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, and in America, especially, it's a big part of American ideology, isn't it? To be happy, and even in Australia, given that we're heavily influenced by America, do you think it's a modern phenomena, or do you think happiness was always a part of just the human condition? Because I would argue love was, but happiness, I'm not so sure. What do you reckon?
Well, I'm actually not so sure. I can't say for sure because, like, I don't have a clear reading of, let's say, happiness of the past. I do know that, and I have more thoughts here that we can go down more of a tangent on, like, based on what I think about what happiness truly is. But at least before we go there, right, I think what really is the confusion around happiness nowadays, before we look at like how long this has been the case, I think is that, I like what you said, the category of happiness. So on one hand, we've got happiness as a category that we talk about, right? Like, I want to be happy. I want this and that, right? And then that's kind of positing happiness as a certain ideal that everyone works towards. And on the other hand, there's something like the feeling or the happiness expressing itself in time, if that makes sense. The feeling of happiness and the idea of happiness. I think they're two very much different things that nowadays we confuse a lot, and we don't really know, like, those two don't really align, and we don't really know what both of them means, like either of them mean, really. So I think that's where we're coming in, where there's lots of contentions, and we tend to use this word in many different ways. And so I guess what we can do in this chat between the two of us is like try and expound some of these ways in which people use these words and try and get a sense of what they really mean, but also get a sense of whether that's actually what they're really looking for. Get my drift?
Totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. But so with that in mind, right, I guess historically, I think what's been the case is that, what's human nature. I think everyone always, like, when you grow up as a kid, you're quite excitable. This is one of my lines of thought. You're quite excitable generally. And then I think you tend to bring on this feeling of excitable, like always looking for amusements to engage you. And you're that tendency, you bring that towards the adult teenage years and adulthood. And so this is more a developmental psychology point of view, I guess, right? Like, and I don't have the theory here, so I'm just speaking from experience, I suppose. Kids grow up looking for things to have fun with, and happiness looks like them getting an ice cream from their parents, or getting to play a game with their friends from their neighbor's house. But then they grow up to be teenagers, and then happiness no longer looks the same. Perhaps, there's a natural stage of development where they become more rebellious, and that somehow looks more like happiness to them, where they get to find freedom in a higher, you get to find a higher level of freedom by doing something. They get a higher level of amusement by playing within the realm of what their freedom is. And so there's an interesting development there as well, I think, when it comes to happiness in the lifespan, because that changes as you grow up from a kid to a teenager, etc. My other line of thought is that happiness is, and why I think this has been around for a long time, is I think happiness is very much like a reliance on external factors. And that's pretty much the thing to which Stoicism was a defense, right? Or like Stoicism and Buddhism, maybe modern day
Western Buddhism.
Yeah, Western Buddhism is a defense, right? We're like, let's not let external circumstances determine our state of mind, let us only base our present state of mind on things of the internal, something like that, or like things that are ever present. And so in that way, they detach themselves from external factors. And I think that's very much, in a way, like detaching themselves from a primitive form of happiness, let's say. But yeah, so those are two pathways. My mind.
I would say this though. I want to draw or connect some points here. I think what you describe more as a kid, being amused or kind of wanting an ice cream or whatnot, that is perhaps something like pleasure. So in the Freudian sense, like basically we humans, we pursue pleasure, the pleasure principle. The reason that I think Zizek is 100% right to say that happiness is a category for slaves is because for me, happiness is in fact an ideological imposition. It's an ideology. Think about it, right? When we talk of happiness in contemporary times, and if we connect it to things like Stoicism or Buddhism, generally that falls under the umbrella of, I would say, neoliberal capitalist ideology that don't the system, don't question the system, control what you can control. And in fact, it even goes one step further and says, read some stupid self-help book by Ryan Holiday or some Stoic book, and like meditate. Going back to the meme, meditate 5 hours a day, read 1 million self-help books, and just completely focus. Silo yourself, focus on yourself. And even when it comes to caring about, this is where it becomes very cynical. Even when it comes to caring about others, it's always, for you to be happy, you need to have social relationships. You need to have other people in your life. So even other individuals are viewed as a means to an end to be happy. Whereas for me, I don't think historically that was the case, where in some sense, again, I'm very Hegelian here, human beings didn't even think of others as being a means to an end or separate to them. Of course, there was tribal. I'm not romanticizing the past. So that's not what I'm doing. People have always been shit. People are shit now. People are always going to be shit. But there wasn't this idea. But the thing about tribalism in the past was, yes, people despise the other tribe. So within their tribe, they didn't view other people as a means to an end. It's only in modernity, or perhaps I'd say more saliently in the 20th and 21st century, that in fact people are viewed as a means to an end to be happy. And I think that's a ideological imposition. It's a ideological construct.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And actually, my mind went there, but I think in mentioning what I did earlier, I kind of forgot about it. But it's also, I think, the third factor is not just how happiness is a human factor, but it's also, at least its gravity nowadays is a lot more compared to perhaps hundreds or thousands of years ago, and we can attribute that to capitalism. But it's also the pros as much as the cons, right? I think one of the pros is pretty much that people nowadays live pretty comfortably. And so where in the past you would have families growing up on a farmland and their kids grow, like when they grow up, what do they grow up to do? They don't grow up to play with toys. They grow up to work the farm.
Yeah.
Right. And so they don't worry about happiness. They have no happiness to worry about, or like they're engaged in work so much such that, playtime and work is carefully delineated, and they don't have much time to worry about looking for happiness or like attaining the thing that will endow happiness upon them. You know what I mean? So I think that's the historical element as well, where nowadays people are a lot more free, they're a lot more comfortable, and perhaps you can attribute some or all of that to capitalism and modern, economics and markets and how things are right now. But I guess on the flip side, it's the fact that capitalism kind of plays on that as well, right? Because then it's like you're comfortable, you're free to do whatever you want.
Formally free, not really.
Yeah, you're formally free to do what you want. You're all now in a position where you can just look for pleasure because you've always got food on the table. You've got a safe house, right, to live under. You've got everything you need. Your basic needs are all filled. Now, you still want pleasure. You still want to feel happy. we've got the answer for you, right? And so
Buy this product.
Yeah, it's a very
engage in
interesting
this
kind of
whatever
right? I
self-help
think
thing or meditation thing.
yeah. Where I think like capitalism in a way has enabled a lot of comfort, let's say in the modern day, where people can go as far as they want and people can really create their own lives according to their own terms. I suppose that's a muddy one as well. But now it's also kind of caught them within this like rat race, right? Where it's like, you know, you live your way to comfort by means of working your way there. And then if you want to leave your way to happiness, you know, you keep playing within the same, you know, little rat wheel, if you know what I mean, like on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing.
Yeah, it's like the Jay-Z song. On to the next one, on to the next one. I can't play it because of YouTube.
I haven't heard that.
I'll send it to you. Because, you know, in fact, this is the point Todd McGavin makes about desire. Because human beings keep desiring, right? So the way capitalism works is it works. In fact, you know what, man? Let me read the quote. It's a beautiful quote. Give me just I've got this quotes bookmarked on my computer. So while this, okay, it's when I want it to work, it's not working. That's in fact the point I was going to make about capitalism. Capitalism works by not working. So I'll read the quote out, right? Capitalism has the effect of sustaining subjects in a constant state of desire. As subjects of capitalism, we are constantly on the edge of having our desire realized, but never reach the point of realization. This has the effect of producing a satisfaction that we don't recognize as such. That is, capitalist subjects experience satisfaction itself as dissatisfying, which enables them to simultaneously enjoy themselves and believe wholeheartedly that a more complete satisfaction exists just around the corner, embodied in the newest commodity. So this is by Todd McGavin, his book, Capitalism and Desire, The Psychic Cost of Free Markets. And I had a small commentary on that. Sorry for reading out my own work, but it goes like this. Since our lack is unfulfillable, so we spoke about lack in the last episode, right? Or last conversation. Calling an episode is kind of weird. Since our lack is unfulfillable and our desire is unmeetable, we are the perfect subjects for capitalist dynamics because paradoxically, capitalism works by not working. We are always kept on the edge of having our desires met by, in fact, not having them ever met in reality. So it's kind of like a twist where because what we are desiring is, to use a Lacanian term, objet, which is something that doesn't exist. It's a virtual concept, and I think that's therefore we constantly desire something that we can't ever get. And I think happiness is a quintessential example of the objet, of this like virtual concept where we are told to be happy, but first of all, we have no idea what that even means. So the ideological imposition is be happy, but then within our innate psychic being, we also are desiring this thing that doesn't exist. And in our contemporary society, that thing is happiness. And I think that's also why, going back to Zizek's point, it's fundamentally a category for slaves. Because when we are happy, then we are within the system, never question the system, whatever the system is. And I'm not even talking politically. I mean, at a very sociological level. So this is everything: religion, culture. So it's purely not political. And of course, when Zizek defines ideology, he never means in a political sense. He means these socio-symbolic order that gives our life meaning. So that's way deeper than politics.
And like happiness as an ideal.
It's an ideal, right? And that's the ideal we are pursuing. And I think, well, you know what? This is really interesting. The topic of the conversation is, should we be happy? And I never asked you that question. So Euwyn, go. Let me put it on the table for you to first answer this. Why should we be happy? Or should we be happy? I even got the question wrong, for God's sake.
Why should we be happy?
Let me rephrase. Should we be happy?
Yeah, should we be happy? It's like, I can imagine Jordan Peterson now saying like, oh, well, it depends what you mean by happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Please don't pull a Jordan.
No, actually,
I was the fucking question. Yeah, nah.
I was actually searching up Jordan Peterson quotes on happiness because I know he has done a lot of talking on it. And I'm actually interested to get into what he says because I think there's very much the two sides of the coin, right? Like there's the the one everyone starts with, which is what we're kind of talking about now and kind of going around with, which is, people who posit happiness as the ultimate ideal for them without seeing the strings that, pull that around them. You know what I mean? Which is, it could be the strings of capitalism that says like, hey, this thing is always dangling in front of you. And obviously money, let's say, is the machine, is the electricity that keeps the machine running. And that's the string of capitalism. And there's also just the string of, psychology, I guess, where we're always searching for pleasure and we're always searching for this and that. And so these are like, the layman doesn't see all of this happening. They're just like, I just want to be happy. And that's like the order of things I mentioned earlier, right? Like if you ask someone like why they're doing something, chances are they'll land on, I'll be happy, and they won't be able to go further. I think on the flip side, like why I mentioned Peterson is because then the usual conservative traditional kind of overcorrection to that is like, yeah, happiness is moot. Like, just it's all about work. And it's like, especially the dad on the farm says happiness is like useless, pleasure is pointless, work the farm, right?
Yeah, duty. This is like the Max Weber argument in his book, what's it? Capitalism and Protestant Ethics, or Protestantism and the Ethics of Capitalism, whatever. The one, his book he wrote.
Yeah. So just like screw pleasure, work the farm, right? And I also think there's something problematic with that. Like that's an oversimplified kind of like repulsive reaction, I guess, to the, let's say, the pleasure impulses of youth, right? And so there's these two sides, I think, where I do have problems with. But your question was, should we be happy? That is one that I guess we are going to dive into this kind of over this chat.
Well, I mean, let's dive into it, because I feel like what you did again was which I think we both are kind of doing right now. We're giving like a social analysis, but purely at like a philosophical level, the category of happiness, what is that to you? How do you understand it? And in fact, I think you and I both agree, because we've spoken about this before, is that it is not something that's that important. It is not something. I don't think either one of us are saying go and be unhappy and depressed and miserable. Of course not. But I don't. For us, like, we don't put that in like one of our top values. Like when people say, "Oh, what do you want in life?" It's people say, "I want to be happy." What not for me? I don't even think about it in that way. So at like a philosophical, or perhaps to bring it down a bit more to earth, at an existential level, what is happiness for you?
Yes. No, that's a good question. That's a good question. I'll try and keep it more personal, I think. But so earlier I mentioned about the excitable kid, let's say the developmental side of happiness. I think that was very much my own experience, right? And if I were to define happiness in this regard, I would define it as something like a state of being where you feel pleasure in the moment. Something like that. I think that's a fair definition to give at least myself over my life, and I think it's quite universal. Where, as I mentioned earlier, as a kid, if I'm like, Mom, I want ice cream, and I get an ice cream, I feel happy. And then the next time I pass by McDonald's, in search of the same feeling of happiness, I will bug my mom again and say, hey, Mom, I want the ice cream again. She'll say, no, I'll be unhappy. And then I'll sulk and I'll cry, and it won't be a good feeling. And to me, I had a bad day. Right? That's how it works as a kid. And then, I grow up and happiness takes different forms. It's no longer asking my mom for an ice cream, because ice creams become boring. And to me, this is actually a kind of a theory that at least something I'm trying to flesh out in my own writing. But we begin to get pleasure or find amusement in different things as we grow up, right? So as a youth, then I grow up not by being fed by my family, but by rebelling against my family. So I would, family here can equate to your tyranny, right? I guess whatever tyranny you have in your life.
Let's call it the symbolic family.
Symbolic family. For other people, it might be rebelling against the state.
The state,
Against an idea, or like against an idea, or against capitalism, or against Christianity, religion, whatever, right? And so I think everyone goes through a similar phase. And so me, it's like, hey, my parents wants me to be a symbol of good. You know, I'm a pastor's kid. I should be a good example. Like, I'm going to be the opposite of that. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to, you know, do all sorts of weird stuff. I'm going to like cross all the boundaries. And true enough, like I got punished all the time in school, but that's what happy looked like to me, although I wouldn't call it happy, because as a kid, as a teen, you're not really self-reflective. But then I guess you grow up to young adulthood, and then that kind of develops as well. And I think that's a natural development, although for some people, they don't overgrow different stages of the development of happiness. But I guess, you know, at least for me, going from teenage life to youth to a young adult, I guess happiness began to be like, all right, you know, I'm kind of tired of making my parents disappointed all the time. Maybe a version of pleasure now, a version of amusement looks like me making my parents proud of me and coming home to a house where my parents receive me happily and seeing them with a smile on their face. That you know is genuine, because they are actually proud and happy of you. And so then kind of the definition of happiness again evolves there, right? And I conflate happiness and pleasure here. And so like right now, I guess where happiness has gone to is it's kind of an effect of growing, I guess, when pleasure, the importance of, I don't think, like what I mentioned earlier about Peterson coming in with like happiness and pleasure being done away with because that's not important. I actually think that's not a good categorization. I think personally for me, I think, as I mentioned in my narration of my own history, I guess, it's not that you do away with happiness or you do away with pleasure. It's that the definitions of pleasure and happiness change over time. And so they seep into different territories. They expand in their breadth and they deepen in their depth, right? And they might become something else quite entirely. And I think one of the effects, at least that I've faced in my life, is that happiness for me now has gone from like the finite to the infinite. And so I find that quite a fascinating thought to think, right? Which is, as a kid, you want an ice cream. It's something very finite. You eat it, you finish it, you're done. And then when you grow up, you want to see your parents proud. Now that's not so finite anymore. That's more, it takes a lifetime, well, it takes a long time to make your parents proud of you. And so then it kind of draws out in time, right? And then you're like, all right, I want to make my parents proud of me. And that's what living happily looks like. And then after, like, where I'm like, even going from there, it's like, if you go to the infinite, you go to the eternal, it's like, you want to live a life that makes you proud of yourself. And by that same token, like makes God proud of you is a bit of an interesting formulation, but that where you can say the verse in the Bible where there was a scripture, I can't remember which part of the Bible it was, but it says, you know, he has run the race, he has run a good race, he has kept the faith, something like that. So it's really a declaration of a life that has been well lived, right? So it's kind of, that's still very much to me, still within the realm of pleasure, really, and happiness. It's just that the definitions widen and broaden and deepen, and they take on infinitely different forms. And so, yeah, I think that's generally the development of where man, and obviously I'm applying quite a broad definition of happiness here, but I'd love to hear how it was for you too. Like, how do you find that? Do you find any similarities in your own journey, or do you like have a totally different view of what it means to you?
Well, certainly there are similarities. I would say I am a bit more hedonistic than you are. So I do tend to find, I think I tend to pursue a lot pleasure, and like I lack self-control and whatnot. So as you know, being my best mate, it's something that I've been trying to work on recently. Although I would say when it comes to the developmental part of things that you were discussing, for me, it's the idea of, and I think this is a Freudian idea too, where we do try to always know what our mother wants, right? Freud, you know, Oedipus complex, and it's the idea is we try to first find out what does our mother want, how can we fulfill her desires. This is more of a Lacanian part, but then afterwards, as we mature and become most socialized beings, we start trying to figure out what the other wants. So the other is, let's call it, for all intents and purposes, our social circle, our friends, and then other in like a very symbolic sense, where we can't put any substantial material content to define it. But when in our mind, it's for instance, when people say things like, "Oh, you know what they say," or "You know what those people are doing," like, who the fuck is they? It's Use a Heideggerian term, it's a Dasma. It's a very symbolic category. So I think I view, for me though, that's where it comes, where I'm trying to like impress someone or impress the day, Dasma. And this day is purely a formal category, symbolic category. Although I don't know about this thing about you talking about the ideal, that certainly is there for me. That like radical, subjective fulfillment of some ideal. For me, it's something around love and truthful speech. Although for me, humor plays a big role too. Like I really think humor is important for a well-lived life. And now here's where I can connect this to another little thing in our meme, which is the "I need therapy!" exclamation mark thing in the meme, where I'm gonna connect the way I define and view happiness, and then kind of try to answer the question, should we be happy, by connecting it to therapy. So I think colloquially, in our society, when we mean happiness, and when I mean we, of course, myself included, we think of this kind of like lasting bliss, this state of nirvana, where we have this contentment, we're content, everything is like not perfect per se, because again, I think all of us know, at least subconsciously, that perfection is impossible. But even when we say don't be a perfectionist, that itself is a ideological demand to live a life of achievement, of excellence. So I think this kind of bliss we talk about, it comes from again, wanting to have this kind of lasting happiness and this state of equilibrium, let's say, where everything comes together. I've got my, this is very like typical, right? I got my health, wealth, and my faith, spiritual life. I've got everything is in order, all the boxes ticked, and then I'm in a good place, right? So I think it's again, it's a very kind of like a quality of life sort of thing. And those things are, by the way, don't get me wrong, again, they're great things. I think we need to build a society that does in fact promote and improves the probability that the most amount of people, this is not a utilitarian argument, but it sounds utilitarian, I know, but the majority of people can live a relatively healthy life where they have free time, whatnot, and live a good quality of life. Okay, that's I'm being a bit long-winded, but then connecting that to therapy. Now this is a bit of a sensitive point. I think I need to be very careful when I articulate this, because obviously this is a very touchy topic, and a lot of people that I know, in fact most of my friends, go see a therapist. So when I do critique therapy, I need to be respectful and careful. So I'll try my best to articulate this well, right? So I wrote down a few points before the conversation, just so that I don't get lost, as I tend to do normally. So firstly, a few caveats, right? Obviously, I'm not a clinician. I mean, look at me. If I'm a clinician, all my clients would end up killing themselves. So therefore, I'm not a clinician. This is not expert advice. It's just a random guy on the internet giving his opinion. I'm just another philosophy bro online. And the other thing, I think this is quite important, because I've never been to therapy in my life. I don't know what it's like to go see a therapist. The reason being is not because I haven't had low moments. Well, I would say I'm generally a pretty happy guy, so I haven't really felt the need or desire to go see a therapist. But also, man, as you know, I never stop talking. I never shut up. If I go and see a therapist, I'll talk eternally, to the point where I'll drive the therapist insane. So for the sake of for the sake of the therapist's mental health, I'm not going to go for therapy, because I'll drive the guy insane. Right?
How generous, Rahul.
Yeah, I'm just being a nice guy, Okay. So when I'm critiquing therapy, though, this is how I'm connecting it to a broader topic at hand, which is happiness. I'm critiquing therapism, which for me is an ideology. therapy is it's a social reality. It's got the category of therapy is very important. It's important for I view therapy put it under the umbrella of healthcare. I think the government should pay for it. I don't think people should ever pay as being a leftist. People shouldn't pay a single cent to go see a therapist. It's really important. And if you want to go see a therapist, go see a therapist. Although therapism is totally different. It's an ideology, just like any other ideology.
Like, it's like science and scientism.
Exactly.
Two different things.
It's like science and scientists. They're different things, right? So therapism, the ideology itself, comes with a lot of presuppositions, and it comes with a lot of imperatives, moral imperatives. So I'll break down my argument in two ways, right? I'll say therapism, we have therapism. Therapism is more like an ontology. So when people fall into the ideology of therapism, which I think we've all kind of fallen into, people essentially view the world through therapy. The world itself becomes like, so you hear things like, everyone talks about trauma these days, trauma, and they're trying to fix their trauma. Everyone's trying to fix their trauma. And then the solution to everything. So this is kind of like a sociological critique here. It seems that in our society, the solution for any kind of despair, any kind of unhappiness is go see a therapist. Go. People never question, why is it that we have a we in fact do have a mental health crisis? Why do psychometricians or psychologists have this term, or it's a neologism called deaths by despair? Why is this such a crisis in our society? People rarely question. The answer is always go see a therapist, go and talk to your therapist about it, right?
Yeah.
And for me, that's a tragedy. I don't think that's how we should analyze society, by just, the constant prescription is go see a therapist. And that's what I mean by therapy as an ontology. And then, of course, again, therapy speak. People talk in the terms, everyone identifies with, I've got anxiety, I've got depression, whatnot. So people's identity, it's formulated around, generally it's depression or anxiety. And again, if you've been diagnosed with any of these things, those are real things. I'm not denying mental illness in any way. It's just, again, the ideology. I need to keep putting this caveat because it's a sensitive topic and I don't want to misspeak here. So my sociological critique is this, right? And this is, I don't think Lacan himself said this, but I watched a lecture on Lacan. Perhaps Zizek, I forget. Oh no, it was in fact a German Lacanian who spoke about hysteria. So psychoanalysis, in fact, started off because so-called hysterical women were sent to Freud, and that's how the whole field of psychoanalysis started off. And then in the 20th century, all these, I hate the term hysterical women because it's such a misogynistic, loaded term. All these hysterical women, as the term was used, was sent to see psychoanalysts, and they were like, these women are crazy, they're hysterical, fix them, something's wrong with them. But of course, Lacan's point was the hysteric was right. The symptom of hysteria was because, obviously, these women were in loveless marriages. They couldn't leave their husbands because, no-fault divorce wasn't a thing back in the day. They couldn't work. They had no freedom. They were just locked in their house. And they were essentially just, they were typical victims of patriarchy. And of course, not all women. Some people are actually hysterical. But the symptom itself doesn't just appear spontaneously. It's always connected to a social reality, which is why I like Lacan over Freud, and certainly over Jung, because Lacan, or at least Lacanians, always focus on social structures, on our sociology. So the point that this lecturer was making, and I've forgotten his name, I feel bad because it's a really good lecture on Lacan, is that, I mean, what do you expect, mate? Of course, if you're living like a slave your whole life, you would go crazy, you would be unhappy. And the way that I critique therapism with this argument is that the whole thing about therapism is that we rarely question the structures that cause these symptoms or mental illnesses, so to speak. We always just say, the problem is with the individual, go and see a fucking therapist. Go and fix yourself. My thing is, no. Yes, it could be something with the individual. We all have problems in life, certainly. But what about the structural critique? What about looking at society and seeing how can we change the structures of society where perhaps less people will have such radical destructive symptoms that leave people in anxiety or depression. And then sorry, I'll finish the argument and I'll get to you. And then, of course, the other side of therapism are the annoying stoic bros. People who say this is perhaps even worse than telling people to go and see a therapist, because at least by telling someone to see a therapist, we're acknowledging there's something, or there's a pain, there's something wrong. But the stoic bros are, oh, no, this is just in your head. You can't control what's going on in the world. You can't critique society. It's a very conformist slave category to be a stoic. And then, so just control what you can control. And then the worst part is you give them some stupid book by Ryan Holiday or some self-help book and read this and you'll feel better, right? I mean, man, fuck off, like I want to punch people like that on the face. No, if there's something wrong with someone, you don't just tell them it's their fault. Firstly, you see, it could be both. It's not either or. It could be their fault and a structural problem. And then the second point is, okay, so the other thing is this, right? In therapism and therapy, I would also say this is a point made. I think she made a really good point. So for context, is our mutual friend, and we were talking about this on Saturday. She's brilliant, very smart person. And she said, yeah, so the way therapy helped, I wonder if I should bring up her name. It's fine. She's open about it. The way therapy helped her was that it showed her how, these things you can come to a point where you can function in society. And I think that's great. I think that's beautiful. If therapy can do that to people where they can be functional human beings, that's lovely. But the problem, again, with therapism is then everything becomes this kind of pragmatic thing where if there's something wrong with someone, go and get them fixed, get their head fixed, get their head screwed in, and then they'll be functional human beings. And generally, the way the DCM-5, which is the taxonomy for, is it DCM? Yeah, the taxonomy for mental illnesses by the American Psychological Association. So the way they categorize is being able to work. So the idea is as long as you can do a job, you're fine. Your mental health is fine. So that's what a functional human being is. And in fact, that taxonomy is a very, it's rather controversial, especially amongst psychoanalysts, because there was a time where homosexuality was considered a mental illness. There was a time where being trans was considered a mental illness. So that list is always changing and it's growing. And so therapy is a way of coping, great, but therapism where the imperatives are, it's always you focus on the individual, that's toxic, that's pathological. It has to be critiqued. And the second point is the existential point. So my understanding is that a lot of people who see, this is a very controversial thing to say, so again, take what I say with a grain of salt. A lot of people who go and see therapists should just perhaps read Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, because it's like Schopenhauer, because like a lot of the existentialists, the things they point out are essentially what it means to be human. And there's something rather consoling in the fact that, so Kierkegaard talks about angst, or the dizziness of freedom. So anxiety isn't always something wrong with you. It's a part of our existential human condition. And that's what the existentialists find out. So my point is that in many ways, sometimes it makes sense. And I know not everyone can read Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Not everyone's obsessed with these things the way you and I are. But sometimes what we label a mental illness or mental health problem is really just a part of being human. It's an existential reality. And which is why, obviously, Freud was a proto-psychoanalyst. Nietzsche was a proto-psychoanalyst. A lot of the ideas of Nietzsche's, Freud's unconscious, Nietzsche was already talking about that in the form of the will. So yeah, the two arguments, my God, that was a really long monologue there. But my two arguments are, the way I connect this to happiness is that it seems that the imperative of therapism, again, is as long as you're happy, you're fine. And how to be happy? Go and see a therapist, talk to a therapist every day. That's really important. And then go and read self-help books. Take, spend like 10 hours a day meditating or doing all these self-help, self-care things. And for me, that is again a conformist slave category. It's okay sometimes to challenge our existing status quo, our system, despite not having your own house in order. So Jordan Peterson can fuck off. It's okay sometimes to criticize the world before making your bed. Anyway, I'll shut up. That was the point I was trying to make. That was really long.
But no, that was a
I put a
very
lot
good point,
there.
Grace. I just have to organize everything I have in my head right now because
Yeah.
there's
Because
lots going.
I wrote it down because I know it's a sensitive topic, and I kind of wanted to articulate that, as I think it's
that's fine. That's
highly
fine.
correlated to happiness.
It is a very interesting. It is a very good point you raised because I think it's a very important one, and I think very much the bit you mentioned on the social structures as the cause of lots of the modern, what's the best word for it? Modern anxiety, the modern
symptoms,
or modern symptoms, right?
Symptoms,
that leads to therapism that you speak of is very much downstream. I think from the existential that you spoke of in the second point, right? At least that's how I see it, because it's like, what is society? It's the collection of peoples and people trying to manage peoples, basically, right? And that is just the effect of human nature, just kind of extrapolating over very many layers and over many systems. But the reality is that humans are not perfect. We have desires, we have passions that go against the way things should be. That goes against the way things should be, right?
Yeah.
In many ways. And so in many ways, the human is at war with oneself.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, this is again a very existential point. Sorry to interrupt you, but we have this constant struggle within us. We
have this constant struggle with
war going on in us.
That only extrapolates itself over the collective, right? And so it's very much the existential point, I think the modern person loses touch with, right? It's the modern person loses touch with the idea of the human condition. And the interesting thought here I had is that this is kind of the exact flip side of what we're talking about happiness, right? Because you talk about what is happiness to a layman? It's if you experience a certain series of good feelings, that's happiness. And if you experience a certain series of bad feelings, that's something like depression. So I think it is very much a very interesting thing where they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Again, as you so often said, the caveat, right, is that, without being dismissive of actual conditions and actual things that do require help. But the idea, I think, is that the whole therapism idea is when we lose touch with what it means to really be human.
Well put.
And it's like being human is not sunny, blissful flowers and all day. There's also the night and the storm and the rain comes, right? And you deal with all that. That's very much human. That's very much universal. And you mentioned that a lot of the reason why the modern human or at least other people don't see this is because they don't read Kierkegaard or Schopenhauer.
Look, I wouldn't. I was partially joking.
No. But that is because that's where I'm going to. I think that is true to a certain extent, but it's because in the past, I think the religious element subsumed that, which we have also lost, right? Like, for example, Christianity posits man as fallen, and so what we do is we approach God as broken, and that's fragmented, and that's the assumption, right? Like, no one enters into religion as a perfect being, saying like, I'm fine. Any bad feelings I have, I just go to therapy. I get back to like my
true self, my authentic self.
Yeah, and then I'm fine. That's not the case within religion. Within religion, at least the Abrahamic and the Eastern ones, there's always something that you ought to aspire to. There's always an explanation that, as a base, right, human nature is very much flawed and fragmented, and there are lots of problems with it, and that's why you have to, at least in Christianity, you have to carry your cross and follow Christ, right? And so I think part of why we've kind of gone towards therapism is in part due to the loss of these axioms, right, that we have within culture, which is that human nature is fundamentally flawed. So,
and that's a really, almost, I would say, for modern people, that's a really almost traumatic thing to confront. Because Lacan says one thing about, like, for him, one goal of therapy is in fact to confront this reality. He doesn't put it in religious terms, although he calls it split subjects. Similar thing. We are fallen, broken beings. And for modern people, telling them that no, you are a broken person, and it's kind of like essentially who you are. You have
Well, because
that's
like,
like,
what
oh my
today's-
God, that's
exactly.
traumatic. That's too
I
much.
mean, that is very contrary to what people say, right? Nowadays, there's lots of
you're beautiful just the way you are.
You're perfect. You're perfect the way you are. There's lots of
as my best man, if you ever say I'm perfect just the way I am, our friendship's gonna end. That's it.
Well,
say
likewise,
I'm walking out of the room. All right.
likewise. But yeah, no, like these exhortations are like plenty nowadays, right? Like, you're perfect the way you are. You're okay. Just don't change yourself. You know, you are you. Just be yourself.
Yeah.
Just be authentic. Just be true to yourself. They're all part of the same realm of thought, and I think they're quite dismissive of the fact that human nature is fundamentally flawed, and there's fundamental problems to pure just existence as it is. So I think that's where therapism is very much the flip side of happiness, in that it's very much got similar causes, where the modern, let's say, what would you call it? How we're all tied so tightly to the idea of happiness, and how we're tied so tightly to the idea of therapism.
Yeah, because like I would put it this way. I think the goal of therapism, therapism is an ideology. It doesn't really have a goal in that sense, but it's deeply tangential to this broader umbrella ideology, or tangential is probably the proper word, of happiness. Because people think, and this is like pathetic, people think the purpose of life is to be happy. I mean, anyone who reads you don't even need to read that much. Like, to read any kind of literature, you would know that that's a modern concept. Happiness is rarely talked about in the past. The purpose of life is not to be happy. I know, sorry to break it to you, but your happiness, no one really cares about it, and it doesn't really matter that much. But then I think firstly, essentially with everything you said, I agree. Although I think it's important to say that, yeah, therapism certainly, it misses, let's just say therapism and the ideology of happiness misses the existentialist dimension, which I think the person who, in my view, Kierkegaard exceeds Nietzsche for me. I think the person who articulated that in the most profound sense is Kierkegaard. Like, for him, he's a genius in that sense. The idea of, what it means to be human, the modes of human existence. But then, of course, the other thing of that is that because the scapegoat of therapism is always see a therapist, go, go meditate, read a self-help book. It's like individually self-care kind of, in that realm, we become complete slaves. We barely question the system. We barely question, because look, one could take the argument you made and misappropriate that and say, oh, so you're saying then, given the fact that this is our condition, we can do nothing about it. But of course, Kierkegaard is the philosopher of freedom. Nietzsche is the philosopher of freedom. They would never say to be these slaves and conform. They would never say that. So I don't think it's fair to say that, just because this is what it means to be human, this is our existential reality, therefore don't question anything, don't critique the system. I mean, we all know how harsh Kierkegaard was against
I think that's right. Although I guess you're positing a more political solution, but where I as I mentioned earlier, I think it is a very much human problem at its core, of which political solutions play, let's say, a marginal part. And I think existential problems require existential solutions.
Wait a minute. I got to challenge you there. But when you say solutions, I that's the thing. I don't know if Kierkegaard and Nietzsche would ever.
No, that's fine. But I do at least think that existential problems require existential
reflection, thinking
approaches. Let's say, right?
Solutions. I agree with that. But
so you see, though, where I'm going is that, for example, with a lot of the modern idea of happiness, I'm very much a Kierkegaard in myself, right? That's very much the whole aesthetic idea. And that I think this is a good point to bring up, because I think it covers both the therapism.
Interruption. Maybe you should describe the stages of life.
I'm going there. The therapism and the happiness that we're talking about, right? That is, the modern person is very much caught up in the first stage, according to what Kierkegaard lays out. That is, the first stage of life's development is the aesthetic worldview, right? Is the aesthetic person who always seeks a certain kind of pleasure in the immediate. And by the flip side, that's either or is the origin of this. And on the flip side, I see very much the whole therapism idea as, in a way, at least when used misappropriated, it's the bad feelings in the aesthetic, in the present as well, construed as such, right? And so the aesthetic person is very much about, what do I feel in the immediate? Let's optimize for pleasure. And then on the second level, there's the ethical dimension, where people are more aware, let's say. The ethical person is more aware of the dimension of aesthetic pleasure, but also equally aware that it's finite and that you can transcend it by, for example, engaging in duty and meaningful things, right? Like, instead of, like, for example, the example I gave from my own life is like, a kid asking for ice cream, or a teenager seeking to rebel, or like in Kierkegaard, in the either or, it's the seducer seducing women, like from one to another, right? That's a Seducer's Diary, which is a chapter in the book that Rahul just showed. And so the flip side is the ethical person. That's the second stage, is the one who engages with marriage, right? Because there's certain beauty in marriage that kind of transcends the beauty of, let's say, running through many women. That's not very clear in the beginning when you think about it, because in our modern way of thinking about happiness, like, it doesn't really fit into the substructure of something long-term, right? And so it's basically saying that there is a higher kind of pleasure, or there's a higher kind of, let's say, this is where people like Jordan Peterson would say, it's not about happiness, it's about meaning, right? But to me, meaning is just kind of a higher kind of happiness. That's how I would categorize it.
Yeah, I would, really good point. Sorry to interrupt, but for me, meaning itself is a part of the aesthetic life still.
Yeah, well, it's very much a part of the aesthetic life, but it's an effect of engaging in the ethical life, right? It's an aesthetic effect because it's a emotion in the present, but it's an effect of engaging in the ethical life, that is doing what's good, what's right, being dutiful to what is deserving of it. Yeah, and so I think very much there are dimensions to how people approach happiness that lead them down different paths, right? As earlier I mentioned, you at the beginning might find happiness in trivial, fleeting things, and this is a very popular thing to say, right? Like, you find the fault in people is when they find pleasure in things that are fleeting. They realize that it's fleeting, and then they kind of react against it, because, like, happiness is fleeting and it's pointless. I'm just been running on a hedonic treadmill, is a popular term nowadays, and this life is all meaningless. And then they come on a descent. But in a way, a descent is an opportunity to realize, right, that there are things that are higher and deeper than that which is fleeting. And so I think very much part of my view on happiness and therapism is like the kind of development of your worldview from things that are finite and fleeting to what is more, let's say, to the realm of what is infinite and eternal, like something that is good for all time. And that kind of gives you a higher dimension of happiness.
Yeah,
I feel like that I guess the sociological, the political aspect can fall as a part of that, right? Like, engaging within the political dimension can be a part of that, but I would posit that within the dimension of engaging.
I agree.
Within the existential realm.
I think one thing a lot of the existentialists missed, except Sartre probably, is that they didn't create a solid theory. There's no such thing as solid theory, but they didn't theorize enough on the political dimension of existentialism as a philosophy. The problem, of course, was the existentialists themselves never called themselves existentialists, except de Beauvoir and Sartre. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were proto-existentialists, right? So the political kind of engagement, I'll put it this way, Euwyn, right? So when we have this high ideal, for me, the ideal is love, and we commit, we serve that ideal. Happiness is merely a byproduct. It's not something we can ever, if we chase it, we'll never get it. And for me, saying love is the ideal is creating a society where we serve that ideal. And that's where the political, sociological dimension comes into it. The social political reality is we create a society which is unlike ours today, which the ideal is capital. It's to make more money, where we are merely, human beings are merely agents of capital. No. We serve love. And that's where I bring together the existentialist and the political. Although, can I ask you something? You respond first, and after that, I'll ask you a question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, I like what you said. It's like in positing happiness as the ultimate ideal, it's kind of you make what was supposed to be a byproduct the end goal, right?
Exactly.
Because I really like something, I think Viktor Frankl, and
Man's Search for Meaning.
Use the word meaning, but I'll maybe use my own spin, which is happiness ensues, right? Happiness should not be pursued, it should ensue. And I think that's very much the case, right? And even in the nature of what people normally realize is that when you pursue happiness, it tends to only go further and further and further away from you. And it tends to, it's always just leapfrogging you by that much. And that's why we call it a hedonic treadmill, because it never ends. It just keeps going on and on ad infinitum. Except when you pursue something else, right? Like love, as you say, when you pursue the love of another. And that's, again, going back to Kierkegaard's stages, it's like the ethical view is when you put duty first. For example, duty to love, I guess, like duty to your wife, your spouse, your duty to God, that like in a religious dimension, right? You then put yourself in a place where happiness can ensue as the byproduct that is supposed to be an effect of engaging with life in the right manner or in a just manner.
Yes, but also it's the idea of course, those things certainly matter, but when we pursue something beyond ourselves, it's something self-destructive. So I would argue the real ethical life is where we fixate ourselves on something that is beyond us, and we pursue it to a point where we end up harming ourselves, in the sense we lose sleep over it, we become unhealthy because of it, we sacrifice a lot. That nowadays, the first thing is always, I've got to have my morning routine, and I've got to meditate, and I've got to take my supplements, and they're great. Take care of your health, that's important. But this is what I would call a life of passion. This is where it's antithetical to the Stoic life, where if it's a political struggle, if you're a scientist, if you're an engineer, if you're trying to build something, it's the life of passion where you this is, in fact, a Lacanian point. It's a jouissance. It's the kind of thing that goes even beyond life itself, as in it's a dimension of existence that you're willing to even sacrifice your own life for. And I think for me, and in that, yes, as a byproduct, happiness can be.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think happiness just becomes trivial.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's it.
Yeah, no,
you got me.
Exactly.
What I was gonna say was, then even when you're happy, you're like, whatever. Yeah, I feel good.
Yeah,
it's
like,
great.
That's a very important point too. Because earlier we mentioned like love and happiness is
my mind. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
We mentioned like how love and duty, by that happiness might be a byproduct. But I think for those who are properly engaged with love and duty, happiness doesn't even occur to them, right?
You don't even think about it.
Consideration. And I think that's probably the right way to approach these things, right? And with passion, right, you kind of just go so hard at a certain ideal that just happiness is not even in the picture anymore. It's something more like to do justice to, or like, to realize yourself, right? Happiness is kind of outside of the picture. It's almost a totally different dimension of a totally different mode of being, right? And that's, in my view, it's something to do with also the idea of happiness being an effect of the fleeting, that is things that are just in the immediate, right? Like you're happy now because you got an ice cream, versus things that are drawn out and, let's say, more infinite, right? Like doing justice to your idea of what the world should be like politically, doing justice to like what your own life should be like, spiritually, like existentially and religiously and whatnot. And that's really a whole different mode of being. The immediate life and the kind of the more infinitely oriented life.
I have a question.
That's precisely the aesthetic and ethical
You
differentiation.
bring me to the question. When you were defining Kierkegaard, or when you were defining Kierkegaard's stages of life, you spoke about the aesthetic and the ethical. However, and this is, I think, the hardest one to define, because it is, in many ways, even Kierkegaard himself, I think, struggled to define this, the religious life, which is something that goes... The third one. So, and I think this still pertains to the topic at hand. It certainly is connected to happiness, therapism, all of this. How do you understand the religious life, Kierkegaard's religious life?
Yeah, that one's interesting. I don't to the I'm trying to connect something to happiness here. I think the person of the ethical person is engaged with duty within life itself, let's say, to a person, to an idea, or to a passion, let's say. To a passion is a bit weird. Let's forget I said that. The religious person seeks to base his life entirely from the point of view of God. And I really like what he says, and maybe we can kind of navigate this together. I really like what Kierkegaard, the concept he uses, which is
eternal model, right? Yeah, the view from God,
or to see from the perspective of God. That is, because God is a very contentious and complex term. It's to see from the perspective of eternity. And to connect it to what I was saying, it's that happiness is very much a thing of the fleeting, the thing of the immediate that only happens insignificant, and it just fizzles out and disappears the very next moment. Whereas to see from the perspective of God is to see from the perspective of eternity, something that's for all time, right? And so that's kind of similar.
I would just add, I would just add one more thing. It would be in Fear and Trembling, when he does the analysis of Abraham trying to sacrifice Isaac for God, and then obviously he doesn't go ahead with it because God intervenes. But the paradox of faith, because certainly in that moment, Kierkegaard says the particular supersedes the universal. So in many ways, the universal, let's say, for our conversation would be our ethical reality, so our social norms, and we are doing it for society. But there are moments in life where we have this like infinite passion, and that's, I think, where faith steps in, where it's not even for society. It's a purely subjective passion, where Kierkegaard would say it's for God, but just to keep this conversation for people that don't like that term, for eternity. And in that connection, I would again go back to that idea of where we have this sense of like Jewish zones, where it's even beyond life. I mean, Abraham is willing to sacrifice the thing he loves the most, his son, for the eternal. It's where we are in a project, some scientific project, a political movement, where this life, in many ways, but here's a paradox though. A lot of people, and here's where I disagree with where how typical evangelical Christians read Kierkegaard. Or I don't think they really read Kierkegaard, but because Kierkegaard would offend them a lot. But the idea that it's the afterlife. No. The Kierkegaardian knight of faith, the hero. Faith is a passion. It's not about the afterlife. The paradox of faith is you don't even know what the afterlife entails or awaits you. It's a pure commitment and fixation. And again, over there, happiness would be a joke. Like, that's not something you think about.
No, that's right. No, actually, so maybe it's worth kind of jumping maybe into a bit of the premise of Fear and Trembling. My only problem right now is I don't know how to link it to happiness, because this seems like such a big step already.
Certainly, man. I mean, I think you did by showing how trivial, and you used to perfect word, triviality. It's maybe.
So right, happiness is kind of the effect of the first stage, right? As the kid that I mentioned in my own personal life in the beginning, that we very much caught up in the immediate. The ethical is where you kind of learn to be caught up in that which is long-term, to use a simple word, and good for all time, meaningful, just, right? And then the religious one's just like such a massive step higher that it's just like happiness just zooms out of significance, and it's no longer a thing to be contented with anymore, because that's an effect of aesthetic. But basically, I think the very interesting premise about Fear and Trembling, which I was just blown away by, is that Abraham is obviously known as the father of faith, and to like to everyone who's familiar with the story in the Bible, it's Abraham was
the patriarch,
a son at a very, very old age. His name was Isaac, right, with his wife, and he got this son after decades and decades and decades of prayer and like fasting and like desperation. And I guess
he was kind of like Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro had a kid at 73. So
really, I didn't know that.
Was kind of like that.
Abraham was like 90 or something. But so his kid is like the biggest treasure. Imagine for like this father, right? The kid is the greatest treasure of everything. Like, find any other thing other than this one kid that he's prayed for his entire life, it would pale in significance. But then at the ripe old age of 99 or 100, I believe, I don't know what it says, I can't remember, something happened where Abraham, I'm not sure what the exact story is now, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Abraham received the
I think an angel came and spoke to him. He had a revelation, let's say. An angel came and spoke
to him. Yeah,
revelation.
That said that God, that said that he was to sacrifice Isaac, basically as a sacrifice to God, right? And if you think about that, like how you really get the weight of that, right? And
we would call him a lunatic in our society.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a lunatic in many ways, because
exactly.
It's not like an imperative.
He's a lunatic, right? And one thing really interesting, I think Kierkegaard did write in a book as well. It's like most preachers, when they say this with nonchalance. They're like, Abraham and Isaac, that's all, right? And then people take away, like, what does some person in the congregation take away? Like, I'm gonna go home and just sacrifice my son on the altar.
It's easy, I'm gonna wake up. It would be I'm gonna wake up, do my meditation on my mindfulness app, do CrossFit, have a cold shower, and then kill my son. Sacrifice.
Yeah, basically. And then the priest will go like, wait, no, what are you doing? Like, why do you want to? Like, why, right? And then you say that's what you preached the other day.
It's not like a simple thing, but the way we think of it, or at least our contemporary Christianity, the way they preach it, is like a very something.
Yeah. So it's like the weight is infinite. You cannot overstate how much weight is in this situation, right? So for Abraham,
I was thinking about this when I was reading Fear and Trembling. If I was in Abraham's position, I'd commit suicide. I would much rather kill myself than sacrifice my son. So this is the predicament Abraham is in. Yeah.
Exactly. And so Abraham is in this indescribably just indescribable position. Yet he goes up and, walking up the mountain to where he was to sacrifice his son. He walks up without missing a step. He walks up as and when the day was scheduled, right at the break of dawn, I believe. He walked up and just put his son there. His son was asking, Dad, where's the ram?
And right before God intervened and said, take a Kardashian instead. Don't
That's exactly how it went.
That's exactly how it was in the Bible. Take a Kardashian instead. We don't need them. No, it was actually a ram. Sorry, Euwyn.
It was actually a ram. Yeah. But no, but Abraham in the moment, right, took out his knife and was just about to kill his son before, as it was written, the angel stopped him. And the willingness of the father to kill his son in that moment, in his very given context, is just indescribable. And here, that's the concept that Kierkegaard comes up with, right? Which is Abraham has had this immense passion for God that subsumed everything else, even his own sense, like even appearing like a lunatic to everyone else, because there's no way in which he can explain this to his wife, Sarah, or to anyone, because he would just look like a lunatic. I'm going to kill my son at the break of dawn with a knife because God told me to. And what Kierkegaard calls this is that he staked his faith on the strength of the absurd, right? That's the concept he came up with, because it's just, it's indescribable. it's like you listen, like you're listening to the command of God of eternity, and he's just, that's what it is. Like that's how that's my command. That's what I must do. I was going to go somewhere with this.
No, I think I get the point. So weren't you going to connect that to happiness? And you were going to say, well, at that point, when Abraham is facing, yeah, when Abraham is dancing with the absurd, where's happiness? Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah. Well, basically, and also to describe what you meant by that faith is a passion.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
is to stake something, an action on the strength of the absurd, because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but that's the interesting thing, because you see, when I say faith is a passion, it's really easy to what's the word, misinterpret that as saying that faith is dogma. Faith isn't dogma. It's not this like fundamentalist. Oh, the Bible says this thing here, therefore, you know, homosexuality is like, it's not that. It's not the reason, and I think Kierkegaard is a genius to use the word absurd. Absurd is the apt term.
Yeah.
There is no way to justify it within the ethical realm. You know, by him sacrificing his son, there is no social good.
Oh, yeah. No, that's right. Because he did say in the book as well, like if you really looked at what he did, and I think Hegel had some statement here that he was connecting to. If you really look at what he did and you look at the Hegelian point of view, Abraham would be evil.
Oh, certainly.
You wouldn't call him a father of faith, and by no means you would look at him with reverence and like with awe, right? Like he's like an example for all of us. But he is, and that says something, that, you know, there is something higher than I can't remember what Hegel said, like something to do with the universal.
No, it is the universal, the Hegelian system. His
yeah. It's like the ethical.
I don't want to bring in Hegel because that's like too much.
Well, actually, I think that's probably going beyond this topic. But basically, that is to say, right? That is like this Abraham having the passion to go beyond what is socially accepted, beyond what is normal. That is like an infinite passion, right? And it's like what you say, to like stake it on the strengths of the absurd. It's like an infinite passion beyond anything that you...
And you know, I think we all, obviously, perhaps the quintessential example is the one Kierkegaard has used from the Bible, the story of Abraham. Although I think which is why Kierkegaard is an existentialist genius. And again, connecting back to Therapism, why reading Kierkegaard you will start seeing, wow, this is a part of human existence, is that we all have certain things we do which in fact are absurd. It's like so I do so many of these things. Like there are so many things that just make no sense at all. I just do them. One, for example, like something silly. I'm currently writing a lecture series on Paul Tillich's Dynamics of Faith. Not a single person asked for it. There's no use of me doing it at all, and I'm not doing it because it's gonna help people. No, it's even, I'm not even doing it for selfish reasons, but it's just an absurd reason that I'm gonna do a lecture series on Paul Tillich's book. Now, of course, there can be byproducts of it, but that perhaps was a bad example, because then one could say, you know, ethical, whatnot. But we all have, it's hard. See, that's why I think the apt term is absurd, because we only know that it's absurd when we are in it, when we partake in it. But we all do things that don't align with happiness or any of these modern concepts we use to describe human beings or make sense of human beings.
Yeah. Well, this is the whole other rabbit hole, right? That life itself is absurd, and but I do think it's part of the human condition that we come up with, right? Which is, if you connect this back to Therapism, it's the fact that life itself doesn't really make sense, which is part of it being fragmented, in my view, right? It's part of it being fragmented. You have no idea what life really is, and that's part of the angst that comes, the anxiety that comes within life, that many people perhaps may misdiagnose to be certain therapeutical problems. But also, I think where it might be a good place to go is to mention the back to the religious and ethical aspect, and kind of bring it back down to what we're discussing, is that I think it's stages of lives, or like, let's say stages of, I kind of hesitate to say stages of life, because I don't think everyone goes through it perhaps not enough people go through it, at least as I've seen myself. But
that's because
at the initial stage, right, happiness is a big thing because it's what forms life pursuit itself. You go to the ethical stage, you realize that happiness itself is fleeting, and that to chase it is to chase it for all time and to always fail. And that's part of the whole absurdity of human existence, right? It's like desire is that which is always, I can't put it into very.
I'll put the way
desire is always just running away from you. Let's say your desire is always running from you.
Yeah, I'll put it the way I'll put it the way the greatest philosopher of our time, Donald Draper from Mad Men, put it. What is happiness? It's just a moment before you want more happiness.
Yeah, exactly. That frames it up well. And then the realization, what that comes with is like, oh, so this is all fleeting. Either I stare into the abyss and realize life is meaningless and I just fall into a pit, or I decide to engage in something. And this is what people like to use after graduating from happiness. I do something more meaningful, right? They like to use the word meaning. I think Jordan Peterson
loaded term.
He's a champion of this, right? Like, you're not looking for happiness, you're looking for meaning. I think that's kind of to go to the next level, right? It's no longer about the fleeting. It's now something about duty. And that's the ethical person. It's about engaging in things that are good for all time, like, getting married, having kids, doing your duty, doing
but
justice.
not just the bourgeois thing. See, but here's where again I challenge the Kierkegaard would step in and say, as you know, Kierkegaard famously he rejected, or he ended his engagement with Regina, because it's not just a typical, because I would say those bourgeois things, get married, have kids, and those are, again, lovely things, but Kierkegaard always leaves room for that dimension where you can even leave those things away. And
yeah. No. Well, those are examples. Like, you could have marry and have kids and then struggle to put food on the table, or just struggle to feed yourself, or like be yourself under a shelter, right? Or be free from your whatever tyranny you're under. And so duty comes in all forms, right? It's kind of a drawn out,
certainly
let's say, mission that you do justice to, that's good for all time. Like, freedom is good for all time, love is good for all time, for example. And so that's to go into the second level, I think, which is meaning, and which is happiness. And it's just kind of the third level at which I struggle to bridge happiness to, because it seems just entirely zoomed out of existence. And so, like,
the third level is like, gay happiness,
Yeah, exactly. So it's like to go from meaning of duty to religious faith, infinite passion, eternity. And like, when I go there, I'm like, I don't know what to say of happiness anymore. It's as if it's like you're talking from the infinite, eternal night sky, and you're talking about an ant. It feels kind of like that.
I'll put it this way, Euwyn, I think this is a good place to end. That this is a very kind of Sartrean point. What you not say itself says it all. As in, the fact that you can't even articulate it in contrast says it all. That's it. I'm not gonna put anything there. As it is. But I mean, that's essentially the point of that meme, was that, I was thinking, we graduate from that point where we're dealing with all, again, trying to be happy, this constantly desiring happiness, and then we come to that, the thing is, when I say it's a stage of life, it's not like it's not a linear succession. It's not like A, B, C, D. That again would be an ideological way of putting it. It's, in many ways, it's something you just fall into and you completely accept, and it uproots your life. It's not like, first I'm aesthetic, I have my fun, then I graduate to becoming ethical, and then I'm an ethical nice person, and then suddenly I'm really. It doesn't work like that. It's something violent. It shakes you, as we saw as we discussed in the example by Kierkegaard with Abraham.
It is. Well, in every level there is a confrontation.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so you're always struggling against something. But I do think kind of the happiness, as we normally talk about it, is, I guess, perhaps something you realize that that's a figment of things that only go bigger and wider and bigger and wider, right? until happiness no longer means anything, really.
Anything. And also, of course, and I think the reason I keep bringing in the political dimension is Euwyn, is because I think, as you're reading Mark Fisher's book, right? We are political, as Aristotle said, man is a political animal. That's not all we are, but the political dimension always bears the ideological imposition, which is why, of course, it's trivial, it's useless, but the unfortunate reality of our times is, because everyone's pursuing happiness, majority of people, that's including you and I, are slaves. It's a conformist category.
No, it's true. But actually, sorry, is that, I also had a thought while you were saying that. I agree with you. But I think this whole graduating from happiness thing also deserves a caveat, right? I think, and it's what we mentioned earlier, it's that it's not that you graduate from happiness and then you're no longer happy. That's like you go into the religious field and then you're no longer happy.
Yeah, we aren't saying that you're
my
people
my
can
sense actually,
I'm glad you put that caveat. Yeah,
that is very much the impression, I think, right? Because like people, what are philosophers? The unhappiest of people. What are, like, I don't know,
and artists, they're struggling, depressed.
Artists, you could even say the same thing about I don't know, even monks, perhaps
ascetics. Like, I mean Nietzsche critiques
exactly.
Genealogy of Morals. He makes fun of asceticism, where it's these pathetic people who are going, I'm suffering. Which is why you shouldn't fall in love with your suffering. That's vanity.
But also, that's not to say that happiness in its primitive form is just thrown away like rubbish. I think it's thrown away as an ideal, in the sense that you no longer, within what you aim towards, you no longer look for happiness. In the same way, perhaps you no longer look for. Actually, I don't have a good example, so maybe I say we don't. At some point, you no longer look for happiness.
Well, I would say like sex, right? I think if you truly fall in love, and if you're in a relationship, I don't think people. So I would put it this way: in true love, sex is not the
true.
Like people don't, in true love, sex just becomes a part of your relationship. But
although people are still horny, so that's a bit of
look, people have sex. Of course, if you're in a relationship, you fuck here and there. But think about it. I think when people are single, sex is more of a factor than when.
Like you get horny for other people as well.
The
libido is strong, right? But I think
that never leaves. That never leaves.
That dynamic is, I guess, not so stark in the dynamic of happiness, because I think it's really a worldview thing, where once it expands to a certain point, it's just really what we mentioned earlier around happiness being a byproduct as opposed to something you chase, is kind of absolutely the case. But what happens is also that you kind of in a very interesting way, you attain higher levels of happiness, right? And this was a caveat I wanted to get to, where it's not really that you kind of.
I don't want to even say that, Euwyn, because I feel like then it's like we're telling people you can have your cake and eat it too.
That's true, but ideology to connect this to what Kierkegaard writes, right? Which is very interesting. It's that you begin in the aesthetic, into that which is fleeting, into that which is immediate. You get into the ethical, but the impulse that gets you to the ethical, and by which the ethical is measured, is still an aesthetic one, because life becomes permeated by duty, things that are drawn out, things that are good and just, but you feel drawn to it still in the immediate. So there's still
there's a beauty to it in this sense. So in Kierkegaard's Iditarod, Judge Wilhelm, right, the ethical writer, the person who writes to the aesthete. So Judge Wilhelm writes about the virtues of marriage and the goodness of marriage. And when he writes of the goodness of marriage, which is an ethical act for him, he delineates that there's beauty. Of course, we all know that, I've seen so many married people where there's a happy, there's beauty, there's lovely. I mean, my one of my cousins recently had a baby. So beautiful, of course, right? I mean, but then of course the purpose of having a baby isn't to be happy. Like that's the thing about it. It's not to have an aesthetic life. It's just something that comes along. So I'm glad you put that caveat though, because I kind of misinterpreted what you said. I thought he was saying that just go to the ethical life in the promise of being happy. the idea is don't think too much about it. If you have it, great, it's good. But that doesn't mean the ethical life or the religious life or whatever the stage dimensions of existence doesn't have a sense of joy, a sense. I would probably use the word joy instead of happiness there.
Yeah, it's like you delight in different things, right? So you no longer delight in the fleeting, you delight in things that are for all time. And then maybe in the religious stage of life, you delight in God himself, right? And I think that is actually a verse in the Bible, which is like, I think a psalm, which is take delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart, something like that. And it's like, the fact is you're not devoid of joy when you graduate these phases, is that you enter into different levels or different dimensions of joy that are one of the effects of which are less, it's less fleeting because it's take on things that are eternal, right? And drawn out. But it's also just deeper, right? Like, to go from the aesthetic, which is the fleeting, you kind of always in the moment, you're looking for the next thing that satisfies you. Whereas in the ethical dimension, you're very much in touch, for example, as we mentioned earlier, with the human condition, right? You know what and in the religious dimension as well, you really know what being a human means. You know what it means to do justice to being a human, and you really engage on this kind of larger sphere. And so really your joy is kind of more deep, it's more absolute, and it's more like incorruptible.
Yeah, and it's more true. It's a true.
Yeah. And so in that way, it's a richer kind of joy in many ways. Although it is quite funny to see all the memes about philosophers being depressed, and I think in many ways they're true. But also one of my ideas, I think side ideas that I have, is a lot of this, the philosophers that we read, I think they're so engaged in their own solitude and their own aloneness and their own creating, like artists, right? They're so engaged in their own creating and thinking and writing that they become embroiled in their own kind of head, that they fail to engage with life as let's say the religious person would, right? They don't engage with the outside world as much. They don't become.
Oh, not Hegel though. Not my guy Hegel.
Yeah, but I think
maybe his landlady pregnant. He's a fun guy. Yeah.
Hegel was... Right, or like Kierkegaard didn't marry, like maybe get married, right? And I guess where I'm going is like, I think lots of these philosophers, they kind of box themselves somewhere, but they didn't live to be emulated in a way Christ did, I suppose, right? And so I wouldn't say like if you were to try out these dimensions that you will become a depressive philosopher. It's that
certainly not. And if you are, c'est la vie. It's not our fault.
It's still lovely, and you'll probably relish.
We're just two guys on the internet giving our takes. So I'm sorry to get depressed after this. But I think that's
it's rich and fun and deep and very exciting indeed.
Yeah, perfect place to end it. Thanks, mate. That was great.
Thanks, man. Love you always.
Love you, brother. Beautiful.